climate emergency?
Are we really in the middle of a climate emergency? This is Tony for A Minute to Midnight, and I urge you to watch this video in its entirety as I cover this whole thing from a lot of different angles. It's not a video that you can watch a small section of and get the whole picture. You need to see the whole thing because each section deals with some different angle of this, and perhaps it may even change your whole perspective on the climate change debate. Please like it and share it. You don't generally hear this mentioned, but during the climate debates at the UN in September, we had a letter sent to the UN Secretary General by Guus Burkert, who is a professor, and it says this: there is no climate emergency. A global network of more than 500 knowledgeable and experienced scientists and professionals in climate and related fields have the honour to address Your Excellencies the attached European Climate Declaration, for which the signatories to this letter are the national ambassadors. The general circulation models on climate which international policy is at present founded are unfit for their purpose. Therefore, it is cruel as well as imprudent to advocate the squandering of trillions of dollars on the basis of results from such immature models. Current climate policies pointlessly and grievously undermine the economic system, putting lives at risk in countries denied access to affordable, reliable electrical energy. I won't read all of it, but you can see there are a bunch of scientists that are named here as signatories to this letter. We ask you to place the declaration on the agenda of your imminent New York session, and we also invite you to organise with us a constructive high-level meeting between world-class scientists on both sides of the climate debate in early 2020. There is no climate emergency, it says. A global network of 500 scientists and professionals has prepared this urgent message. Climate science should be less political, while climate policies should be more scientific. Scientists should openly address the uncertainties and exaggerations in their predictions of global warming, while politicians should dispassionately count the real benefits as well as the imagined cost of adaptation to global warming, and the real costs as well as the imagined benefits of mitigation. Geological Archive reveals that Earth's climate has varied as long as the planet has existed, with natural cold and warm phases. The Little Ice Age ended as recently as 1850, therefore it is no surprise that we are now experiencing a period of warming. Climate models have many shortcomings and are not remotely plausible as policy tools. Moreover, they most likely exaggerate the effect of greenhouse gases such as CO2. In addition, they ignore the fact that enriching the atmosphere with CO2 is beneficial. And further down it says, climate policy must respect scientific and economic realities. There is no climate emergency. Therefore, there is no cause for panic and alarm. We strongly oppose the harmful and unrealistic net zero CO2 policy proposed for 2050.
When they don't seem to be progressing in one avenue, they just reinvent themselves. Is that why the term global warming became climate change?
Yes, in fact, they only reinvent themselves. We have people like Steven Snyder, who in the 1970s were featured in documentaries in search of Leonard Nimoy, warning of global cooling. They flipped sides within 10 years. You could find, I actually was tracing the evolution. Some of the same scientists at NASA, they'd flip sides, go from global warming alarmist, global cooling alarmist, to a global warming alarmist. But absolutely, they use whatever they think will work. And one of the things, the key switch, when you mentioned the climate change, I was at a UN summit in Bali, and it was a John McCain aid. Now, this was 2007. John McCain was co-sponsoring climate bills at the time. His top aide told me that they were going to start blaming weather events on climate. And I was laughing at him, saying, no one's going to buy that. That's absurd. The Earth, there's no way you're going to be able to link storms. There's no trend. Turns out that's what they did. It used to be global warming. In fact, Al Gore's first film was all about global warming, and then it switches to climate change. And that word, I remember even when I was in the Senate back in 2006 and 7, when they were using the word global warming, environmentalists were mad that they were still using that word, and the switchover was going to climate change because they wanted something broader. Because at that point, we had an almost 20-year no change in temperature. So it was hard to claim global warming when the temperature wasn't going up every year. So they changed it to climate change. Now, everything is evidence. Hey, there's a storm in Europe, climate change. There's a heat wave in Australia, climate change. There's a blizzard in the East Coast, that's climate change. My favorite was Al Gore claiming that, this is what global warming looks like. And the pages of the New York Times, they started arguing that record cold and snow were now a consequence of global warming because it was extreme weather.
There are obviously many factors that influence the Earth's climate, and some of these seem to be largely ignored by the climate change alarmists. Here on a website called theelectroverse.net, we see an article which is very interesting. Another climate scientist with impeccable credentials breaks ranks. Dr. Mochitaka Nakamura received a doctorate of science from the Massachusetts University of Technology and for nearly 25 years specialized in abnormal weather and climate change at prestigious institutions that include MIT, Georgia Institute of Technology, NASA, Jet Propulsion Laboratory, California Institute of Technology, JAMSTech, and Duke University. In his book, The Global Warming Hypothesis is an Unproven Hypothesis, Dr. Nakamura explains why the data foundation underpinning global warming science is untrustworthy and cannot be relied on. Global mean temperatures before 1980 are based on untrustworthy data, writes Nakamura. Before full planet surface observation satellite began in 1980, only a small part of the Earth had been observed for temperatures with only a certain amount of accuracy and frequency. Across the globe, only North America and Western Europe have trustworthy temperature data dating back to the 19th century. From 1990 to 2014, Nakamura worked on cloud dynamics and forces mixing atmosphere and ocean flows on medium to planetary scales. He's published 20 plus climate papers on fluid dynamics. There is no questioning his credibility or knowledge. Today's global warming science is akin to an upside-down pyramid which is built on the work of a few climate modelers. In Nakamura, we have a highly qualified and experienced climate modeler with impeccable credentials, rejecting the unscientific basis of the climate crisis claims. The good doctor has accused the orthodox scientists of data falsification in the form of adjusting historical temperature data down to inflate today's subtle warming trend. However, Nakamura writes, the global surface mean temperature change data no longer have any scientific value and are nothing except a propaganda tool to the public. The models just become useless pieces of junk, or worse, as they can produce gravely misleading output when they are used for climate forecasting. Climate forecasting is simply not possible, Nakamura concludes, and the impacts of human-caused CO2 can't be judged with the knowledge and technology we currently possess. The models grossly simplify the way the climate works. Solar input is modelled as a never-changing quantity, which is absurd. It has only been several decades since we have acquired an ability to accurately monitor the incoming solar energy. In these several decades only, it has varied by 1 or 2 watts per square metre. Is it reasonable to assume that it will not vary any more than that in the next 100 years or longer for forecasting purposes? I would say no. So those are quotes from Nakamura. In June, he put out a small book in Japanese on the sorry state of climate science. It's titled Confessions of a Climate Scientist. And he knows his stuff. Remember, Dr. Nakamura is a real climate scientist who's worked at the Goddard Space Flight Center and also at Japan's Agency for Marine Earth Science and Technology. And there are plenty of other real climate scientists and other scientists who do not hold to the man-made climate change and global warming agenda. And here are some more. 90 leading Italian scientists signed petition. CO2 impact on climate unjustifiably exaggerated. Catastrophic predictions not realistic. This is an English translation of an Italian version. It may not be 100% accurate, but it does apparently come very close to being accurate anyway. To the President of the Republic, to the President of the Senate, to the President of the Chamber of Deputies, to the President of the Council, petition on global anthropogenic heating. The undersigned citizens and scientists send a warm invitation to political leaders to adapt environmental protection policies consistent with scientific knowledge. In particular, it is urgent to combat pollution where it occurs, according to the indications of best science. So on. But we must be aware that carbon dioxide is itself not a pollutant. On the contrary, it is indispensable for life on our planet. In recent decades, a thesis has spread that the heating of Earth's surface of around 0.9 degrees C observed from 1850 onwards would be anomalous and caused exclusively by human activities, in particular the emission of CO2 from the use of fossil fuels in the atmosphere. This is the thesis of anthropogenic global warming, promoted by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, IPCC, of the United Nations, whose consequences would be environmental changes so serious as to fear enormous damage in an imminent future unless drastic and costly mitigation measures are immediately adopted. And it goes on and says, I'll skip a bit. However, the anthropogenic origin of global warming is an unproven hypothesis deduced only from some climate models, that is, complex computer programs called general circulation models. On the contrary, the scientific literature has increasingly highlighted the existence of natural climatic variability that the models are not able to reproduce. This natural variability explains a substantial part of global warming observed since 1850. The anthropogenic responsibility for climate change observed in the last century is therefore unjustifiably exaggerated, and catastrophic predictions are not realistic. The climate is the most complex system on our planet, so it needs to be addressed with methods that are adequate and consistent with its level of complexity. Climate simulation models do not reproduce the observed natural variability of the climate, and in particular do not reconstruct the warm periods of the last 10,000 years. These were repeated about every 1,000 years and include the well-known medieval warm period, the hot Roman period, and generally warm periods during the optimal Holocene period. These periods of the past have also been warmer than the present period, despite the CO2 concentration being lower than the current. While they are related to millennial cycles of solar activity, these effects are not reproduced by the models. It should be remembered that the heating observed since 1900 has actually started in the 1700s, i.e. at the minimum of the Little Ice Age, the coldest period of the last 10,000 years. And so on it goes. So there you go. I could read more, but you get the idea.
We have advisors to Pope Francis who believe that the carrying capacity of the Earth is only about 1 billion people. In other words, let's wipe out 6-7 billion people because the Earth can't handle any more than that. And these are people that have gone to the Vatican. I went to a Vatican climate summit and I was threatened to be removed by United Nations security. It was a papal meeting at the Vatican with UN officials, where basically the Vatican married itself to the UN climate agenda. And at this agenda, they had some of the biggest promoters, Planned Parenthood, population control, people like Jeffrey Sachs. I called it an unholy alliance with what Pope Francis did. And it's sad because these advisors, these people were given great credibility. They're tied in with the United Nations. This is behind the agenda. When you look at the developing world, one of their goals is to limit their population.
As this video gets on, I want to show you some of the true agenda behind the climate change global warming scam, and you may be shocked at what you learn. I want to read some parts of an article I wrote some time ago, actually back in 2017, called The Queen of Heaven, A Deceptive Doctrine. Now, there's way more in this article than what I'm going to read, but here we go. Presently, we are witnessing an obvious increase in the embracement of ancient paganism into society. Largely, these were pagan religious beliefs that had many of their roots in ancient Babylon. One of the ways this manifests itself is in goddess worship. This goddess worship, under whatever guise it takes, is a deceptive counterfeit of true and sound doctrine. It certainly should have no place within Christianity. Let us trace the origins of this deception. In polytheistic religions, a goddess is a female deity. Polytheistic religions honour a plethora of gods and goddesses. The modern mother goddess or great goddess personification stems from a combination of female deities from past cultures, blended with generally polytheistic cultures and religions found throughout today's society. Often this is associated with movements loosely known as neo-paganism. This is finding its way into commonly used terms such as Mother Earth or Mother Nature. One of the subtle ways of goddess worship today is through using these terms. Sometimes in goddess worship, terms such as sacred feminine or the feminine divine are used. Usually in one way or another, goddess worship is associated with the earth, the moon, and fertility. Believers in the mother goddess think of the power as a kind of female energy force inside every living thing, as well as in inanimate objects such as earth, moon, cosmos, etc. This type of spirituality often appeals to women who see this as a source of empowerment. However, an interesting fact is that in ancient pagan cultures where goddess worship was common, women were temple prostitutes in the very temples that were devoted to the goddesses. Rather than bringing empowerment, it represented sexual slavery for the appeasement of the goddess. Among many environment and green type movements, the term Gaia is used. Gaia worship is essentially paganism. The goal of these movements is to unite the earth under the goddess of Mother Earth. In other words, they hold the earth up as being a female deity. Generally, among the worshippers of Gaia or Mother Earth, we see a somewhat collective consciousness belief system that holds the earth up as having a spirit to which humans can become attuned. This rejects Christianity's belief of a creative father god. Wiccans hold a belief system that is duotheistic in nature. They believe in a goddess and a horned god. The Wiccan goddess is much like Gaia and is supposedly the mother of all life. This goddess is known as the Queen of Heaven. And there's much more I could talk about the Queen of Heaven and how this is in many different ways seen today. I suggest you go to aminutetomidnight.com and read the article titled The Queen of Heaven, A Deceptive Doctrine. A reasonably large portion of the article deals with Mary, the Queen of Heaven, a Catholic doctrine which I show ties in with this goddess worship. And obviously Pope Francis is a proponent of pushing this doctrine too. I just want to play now a few clips that should show you without any doubt that Pope Francis is pushing for world government and climate change is one of the vehicles he's using for it.
Accepting the urgency, it seems clear to me also that climate change is a problem we can no longer be left to a future generation. We are living at a critical moment of history. We still have time to make the change needed to bring about a sustainable and integral development.
The president called the meeting an honor.
He is something. He is really great. We had a fantastic meeting.
The Pope gave the president a copy of his encyclical, where he makes a passionate case to fight climate change.
I'll be reading them.
Now, something that's particularly notable this year, this is an article by Michael Snyder. It starts off saying, after signing One World Religious Covenant, Pope Francis makes his next push. Just days after the Pope signed the most important interfaith document in history, he had the opportunity to address the global political leaders by video at the World Government Summit in Dubai. During his remarks, he once again stressed the need for global unity, and he encouraged those attending to embrace sustainable development. But he also stressed that sustainable development will never succeed without solidarity. Pope Francis is certainly not the vicar of Christ, that's for sure. He's far more interested in promoting social programs and Marxism than spreading the gospel of Jesus Christ. The book of Revelation certainly tells us that we are heading for a world government, and Pope Francis is doing his bit to push us towards it. And it's also interesting to note that according to this article in Prophecy in the News from January 15th, the Pope told an Italian newspaper La Repubblica that the United States of America has a distorted vision of the world, and Americans must be ruled by a world government as soon as possible for their own good. Pope Francis is showing us his true nature, and pushing us to a world government and a world religion shows us that either he is an ignoramus or, more likely, a deliberate player in pushing us towards the beast system that the book of Revelation and book of Daniel and others talks about.
Carissimi, nell'enciclica Laudato Si ho invitato tutti a collaborare per custodire la nostra casa comune. Serve un patto educativo globale che ci educhi alla solidarietà universale, a un nuovo umanesimo. Per questo ho promosso un evento mondiale che si terrà il 14 maggio del 2020, in modo che in questo villaggio nasca una convergenza globale per un'alleanza tra gli abitanti della terra e la casa comune, un villaggio universale.
And this is his ultimate goal.
Activism works. I'm urging all of you to take part in the global climate strikes on September 20th and 27th.
We want to save the planet! What do we want? Save the planet! When do we want it? Now!
September 20th to 27th, 2019 was marked as a week for global climate strikes. And in New Zealand, this article on stuff.co.nz, New Zealand students will leave school to protest against climate change this Friday, which was obviously at the end of last month. It's the third nationwide strike organised by School Strike for Climate. Interesting, isn't it? Schools striking for climate. Protest organisers have claimed that there are 170,000 protesters nationwide in New Zealand. 40,000 people have protested in Wellington, apparently. Strike numbers were also strong in Auckland, Christchurch and Dunedin. The school strikes want the government to listen and agree to their 5 core demands, which I won't go into the 5 core demands, but the point of the matter is the school system is allowing school kids to strike against climate change. And not only that, but to actually make demands on the government. I find it very interesting that at the same time this is going on, Pope Francis is laying out guidelines to want global education on climate change. In other words, indoctrinating school children and those above school children in this climate change agenda. And you also have British royals lauding Greta Thunberg, who has chosen to not be in school but rather to be a climate activist as well.
Serve un patto educativo globale che ci educhi alla solidarietà universale, a un nuovo umanesimo. C'è bisogno di unire gli sforzi, di far nascere un'alleanza
Calling for a global alliance on education on climate change is certainly no coincidence. Let's look at an article here from Frontier Centre. There is no climate emergency. Speaking at the 13th International Conference on Climate Change held on July 25th in Washington, D.C., Dr. Roy W. Spencer of the University of Alabama in Huntsville said, "There is no climate crisis. Even if all the warming we've seen in any observational data set is due to increasing CO2, carbon dioxide, which I don't believe it is probably too small for any person to feel in their lifetime." Now I will skip down a bit. The so-called emergency is based on nothing but the overactive imaginations of activists who put too much faith in computer model forecasts while ignoring historic records and observational data that tell us nothing extraordinary or unprecedented is happening and demonstrate that the models are wrong. NASA's Goddard Institute for Space Studies asserts that between 1880 and 2017 there has been only slightly more than 1 degree Celsius or 1.8 degrees Fahrenheit rise in the so-called global average temperature, despite a supposed 40% rise in atmospheric CO2 concentration. The National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, that's NOAA, database of statewide extreme weather records, arguably the best of its kind in the world, shows that so far in 2019 only one weather record has been set, the lowest temperature in Illinois history. So this is United States weather. In 2018, the only record set were the largest hailstone in Alabama history, the most rainfall in a 24-hour period in Hawaii, and the most precipitation in 1 year in Maryland, North Carolina, South Carolina, and West Virginia. Many of these records broke, sometimes barely, records that had stood for many decades. In 2017, the only record set was the fastest wind gust in California. No records were set in 2016. In 2015, only 2 records, the most precipitation in a year in Arkansas and the largest hailstone in Illinois history. In 2014, only 1 record, the most rainfall in a 24-hour period in New York. In the first 18 plus years of the 21st century, only 2 states recorded their maximum temperatures, South Carolina in 2012 and South Dakota in 2006. Contrast that with 1936, when 15 states set their all-time maximum temperature records. Meanwhile, NOAA's updated coastal sea level tide gauge data for 2016 show no evidence that the rate of sea level rise is accelerating. Seas are rising no faster than they have for many decades. NOAA's hurricane records go back to 1851. The data show that for almost 12 consecutive years, October 24th, 2005 after Wilma, until August 25th, 2017 Harvey, not one major or moderate Category 3 to 5 hurricane made landfall in the continental United States. That is the longest such period in history. In 2018, for the first time ever, not one violent F4 or 5 tornado touched down in the United States. And in New Zealand, the record highest temperature was not set in the 2000s. It was set in Rangiora in Canterbury in 1973 at 42.4 degrees, which is 108 degrees Fahrenheit. while New Zealand's record low was recorded at minus 25.6 Celsius, or that's minus 14.1 Fahrenheit, at Ranfurly in Otago in 1903, but then it wasn't until 1995 in nearby Ophir that the second coldest day was recorded, minus 21.6, which is minus 6.9 degrees Fahrenheit. And interestingly, 1995 in the southern hemisphere when New Zealand reached that low temperature. Also in the northern hemisphere in Britain, in Scotland, they recorded their record in the same year, minus 27.2 degrees Celsius in Scotland, which equalled the 1895 low temperature. The lowest ever temperature in Northern Ireland was recorded as recently as December 24th, 2010. Now, admittedly, in high temperatures, England this year, 2019, on the 25th of July, reached 38.7 Celsius or 101.7, which is the hottest ever in England, so that's a 2019 record. But if you look at the other countries in the UK, the high temperatures, 2003 in Scotland, 1990 in Wales, 1983 in Northern Ireland. They're all over the place. There's no trend there that I can see. There are some that try to say that the medieval warm period was not global, that it was only localized. Here's an interesting article from Science Nordic. It's an article from 2012, but it says Vikings grew barley in Greenland. A sensational find at the bottom of an ancient rubbish heap in Greenland suggests that Vikings grew barley on the island 1,000 years ago. The Greenland climate was mild when they landed, but was it warm enough to grow corn? Researchers from the National Museum in Copenhagen say the answer to the question is yes. In a unique find, they uncovered very small pieces of charred grains of barley in a Viking rubbish heap on Greenland. The find is final proof that the first Vikings to live in Greenland did grow barley. Now we can see that the Vikings could grow corn, and this was very important for their nourishment and survival. The Greenland climate was a bit warmer than it is today, and the southernmost tip of the great island was luscious and green, and no doubt tempted Eric the Red and his followers. This encouraged them to cultivate some of the seed corn they brought with them from Iceland. Their attempts to grow these crops and barley did not last long, however, as the climate cooled over the next couple of hundred years until the Little Ice Age started in the 13th century. But interesting to note, isn't it? They say the Greenland climate was warmer back then than it is today. So what about ice and the polar melts that the global warmers are always telling us are a huge concern? Here is an article in What's Up With That. The polar ice melt myth. This was May 28, 2019. According to the National Snow and Ice Data Centre, ice currently covers 6 million square miles, or 1/10 of the land area on Earth, about the area of South America. Floating ice or sea ice, alternatively called pack ice, at the North and South Poles covers 6% of the ocean's surface, an area similar to North America. Al Gore predicted in 2007 that by 2013 the Arctic Ocean would be completely ice-free. In the summer of 2012, ice levels did reach all-time lows in the Arctic. Emboldened by this report, Australian Professor Chris Turney launched an expedition in December of 2013 to prove that the Antarctic sea ice was also undergoing catastrophic melting, only to have his ship trapped in sea ice such that it could not even be rescued by modern icebreakers. The professor should have known that a more accurate estimate of sea ice can be had from satellite images taken every day at the poles since 1981. These images show that between summer and winter, regardless of the degree of summer melting, the sea ice completely recovers to its original size the winter before for almost every year since the pictures were taken. The sea ice has been stubbornly resistant to Al Gore's predictions. In fact, the average annual coverage of sea ice has been essentially the same since satellite observations began in 1981. However, this has not stopped global warming advocates and even government agencies from cherry-picking the data to mislead the public. Melting glaciers are another topic of the warming alarmists. Indeed, they can choose to point to some that are actually melting, ignoring those that are growing or remaining stable. Why the differences? They are largely dependent on whether over periods of time more snow falls than ice melts or the reverse. They are a great place to cherry-pick data. The solution to public fear about ice melting and sea level rising is simply using common sense. And by the way, according to this article in The Guardian, Antarctica was once a tropical paradise, even though it's now the coldest, most desolate place on the earth. The South Pole was a tropical paradise. It was a beautiful green place, said Professor Jane Francis of Leeds University's School of Earth and Environment. Lots of furry mammals, including possums and beavers, lived there. The weather was tropical. It's only in the recent geological past that it got so cold. So there you go, they're telling us that the climate has been warmer before, that it's changed before. Was it man-made CO2 that warmed it then? With one breath they're calling it a tropical paradise when it was warmer, and with the other breath they're telling us we can't allow the earth to get warmer through man-made global warming, if there is such a thing. And here's an interesting article. It's called Don't Buy the Hoax, Global Warming Does Not Exist, written by Bob Stadium. Politicians are throwing money that they do not have at a problem that does not exist in order to finance solutions that make no difference. Going down, it says, whatever happened to investigative journalism? Why is the mainstream media not questioning such thinly veiled propaganda and attempted manipulation of our energy policy? Why are they ignoring ClimateGate? Science is not about consensus, it's about verifiable facts and truth. There is no evidence and no honest science supporting the IPCC's dire claims. Models unsupported by observations are little more than garbage in, garbage out musings that can be manipulated to show whatever outcome is desired. The IPCC is long on climate models but short on actual evidence. The IPCC's 97% scientific consensus is fraudulent as well. Look, here, over 31,000 scientists signed a petition saying, whoa, wait a minute, and that can be found at petitionproject.org. Okay, now it's time to start looking at how this global warming scam got started, when it got started, and who started it. And you don't have to go far down the rabbit trail to find this man, Maurice Strong. From the Telegraph, farewell to the man who invented climate change. To this day, global climate policy is still shaped by the agenda of Maurice Strong, a Canadian multimillionaire. This was following his death in 2015. A very odd thing happened last weekend. The death was announced of the man who in the past 40 years has arguably been more influential on global politics than any other single individual. Yet the world scarcely noticed. Had it not been for this man, we would not last week have seen 150 heads of government joining 40,000 delegates in Paris for that mammoth climate conference, the 21st such get-together. In 1992, he masterminded the Rio Earth Summit, the largest political gathering in history, yet few people even know his name. Strong became convinced that the new United Nations should become a world government dedicated to ensuring that the wealth enjoyed by the richer countries of the West should be spread out around the world's underprivileged majority. In the 60s, having become very rich himself from Canada's oil industry, Strong came to see that the key to his vision was environmentalism, the one cause the UN could harness to make itself a truly powerful world government. A superb political operator. In 1972, he set up a UN Environment Conference in Stockholm to declare that the Earth's resources were the common inheritance of all mankind. They should no longer be exploited for the benefit of only a few countries at the expense of the poorer countries across the globe. To pursue this, he became the founding director of a new agency, the UN Environmental Programme, UNEP, and in the 80s he took up the cause of a tiny group of international meteorologists who had come to believe that the world faced catastrophic warming. In 1988, the UNEP sponsored this little group into setting up the UN's Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, that's the IPCC. In 1992, allied with the IPCC, Strong pulled off his greatest coup when he set up another new body, the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, UNFCCC, to stage that colossal Earth Summit over which he presided in Rio, arranging for it to be attended not only by 108 world leaders and 100,000 others, but also by 20,000 UN-funded green activists. It's the UNFCCC which has, in effect, dictated the global climate change agenda ever since. Here's what Breitbart said after his death. Ding dong, the godfather of global warming is dead. One of the most dangerous men of the 20th century has just died, and the weird thing is hardly anyone noticed. His name was Maurice Strong, and though you may not have heard of him, he probably did more to make your world a more expensive, inconvenient, over-regulated, hectored, bullied, lied to, sclerotic, undemocratic place than anyone post-Hitler, Stalin and his personal friend Chairman Mao. He's the reason that climate change is now so heavily embedded within our system of global governance that it is now almost literally impossible for any politician or anyone else whose career depends on state to admit that it's not a problem and to argue that there are more important issues in the world. He was the main instigator of the blueprint for arguably the most sinister and insidious assault on liberty and free markets, Agenda 21. There are many quotes which you can find online directly from Maurice Strong, some of which are quite sinister. I won't read them all. Here's one I will read. It is the responsibility of each human being today to choose between the force of darkness and the force of light. We must therefore transform our attitudes and adopt a renewed respect for the superior laws of divine nature. In other words, theosophy, which is pretty much the de facto religion of the United Nations, with the Lucis Trust, formerly the Lucifer Publishing Company, based in the UN headquarters in New York, founded originally by Luciferian theosophist Alice A. Bailey and still having a big influence on the United Nations today, the Lucis Trust. The Earth Charter, which is in the fake Ark of the Covenant that the UN has, is a set of ecological principles that was put forward in 1994 by Mikhail Gorbachev, Maurice Strong, Secretary General Kofi Annan, Stephen Rockefeller and some others. To quote Maurice Strong, the real goal of the Earth Charter is that it will in fact become like the 10 Commandments. Either we're going to save the world or no one will be saved is another one of his quotes. I've covered Alice Bailey extensively in other videos, so I'm not going to do that here, but I will just quote here one thing. In her blueprint for the New World Order, she said the New World Order must be appropriate to a world which has passed through a destructive crisis and to a humanity which is badly shattered by the experience. Isn't it convenient that Bailey's organisation, the Lucis Trust, or formerly the Lucifer Publishing Company, is based at the United Nations building in New York, and the United Nations has their perfect crisis, a global climate crisis for which a world governing body is needed, supposedly, to fix.
Talking about climate change, of course, and saying that we have to eliminate fossil fuels, all fossil fuels, coal, oil, and natural gas, in 10 years. This would be basically a suicide pact. Over 80% of the US and the world's energy comes from fossil fuels. And the only reason for banning them is the so-called climate apocalypse or climate catastrophe. I see AOC recruiting young teachers and whole classes of young children against the apocalypse, they're saying. They're telling these children that there's going to be an apocalypse in 10 years if they don't save the climate.
First of all, there is no hard evidence that CO2 has anything to do with the changing temperature of the Earth's climate.
No more coal, no more oil. Keep the carbon in the soil.
So, we've mainly been looking at CO2, but there's another boogeyman gas that the climate activists tell us is leading to man-made global warming that we need to deal with, and that is methane. So not only do they want no coal, no oil, no natural gas emissions from industry, etc., but they want to limit natural gas emissions from agriculture, like cows. So let me get this straight. Cows and agricultural animals are the only ones that emit natural gas? Do not the green activists also want to save endangered species and bring a lot of them back from near extinction and repopulate the earth with them? Well, wait a second. Do those animals and birds not also emit natural gases? Or is it only the agricultural ones that people eat that emit gases?
Significant debate around agriculture and its contribution to emissions in New Zealand, probably for two reasons. It's a significant part of our export industries, significant part of our economy, and of course with these emissions, they're ones that are very difficult to control. It's part of the natural processes, and so that's probably why it's been contentious. However, they make up a huge part of our emissions profile. If we're going to take action on climate change, ultimately we have to find a way to reduce emissions with agriculture.
So we've already now seen how many scientists are saying that the climate models are inaccurate and not to be taken seriously. Then you get articles like this in The Guardian in February this year. Sharp rise in methane levels threatens world climate targets. Experts warn that failure to act risks spike in global temperatures. Dramatic rises in atmospheric methane are threatening to derail plans to hold global temperature rises to 2 degrees Celsius, scientists have warned. Right, so there we go. There's our climate models again. This fear-mongering for a 2-degree warm. In a paper published this month by the American Geophysical Union, researchers say sharp rises in levels of methane, which is a powerful greenhouse gas, have strengthened over the past 4 years. Urgent action is now required to halt further increases in methane in the atmosphere to avoid triggering enhanced global warming and temperatures rising well beyond 2 degrees C. Oh my gosh, we better panic, folks. We've got to kill those cows. But if you think that turning us all into vegetarians and vegans who don't drive cars and don't heat our homes with natural gas or wood fires is going to satisfy the climate change activists, think again, because this is the real goal. Population reduction, as seen here on the Georgia Guidestones. Many of the elite rich billionaires see humans as a plague on the earth, and these include people like Maurice Strong. He was outspoken on the need to reduce the population, as are people like Ted Turner, who Maurice Strong also praised. And you have Bill Gates and others also seeking population reduction as part of the answer to the environmental concerns on the earth. And by the way, while they're telling us how dangerous methane is to the environment and how we need to limit the agricultural output of methane, methane levels are rising and scientists don't know why. To make matters worse, scientists aren't really sure what's causing methane to go up rather than down. If we have any hope of slowing down climate change, it's a question that needs answers. Unless, of course, it's part of Earth's natural cycles. Undersea volcanoes may be impacting climate change. A new study claims that volcanic eruptions along the ocean floor may impact Earth's climate cycle. Or this article in Science Daily. Undersea gases could superheat the planet. Carbon reservoirs on ocean floor caused global warming before and could do it again. The world's oceans could harbour an unpleasant surprise for global warming based on new research that shows how naturally occurring carbon gases trapped in reservoirs atop the seafloor escaped to superheat the planet in prehistory. Well, I guess since taxing cows for their emissions is one answer, perhaps it's time to start taxing countries that have undersea volcanoes within their territorial waters as well. Science Daily, November 2018. Volcanoes and glaciers combine as powerful methane producers. Large amounts of the potent greenhouse gas methane are being released from an Icelandic glacier, scientists have discovered. A study of, I can't pronounce this glacier, which flows from the active ice-covered volcano Katla, shows that up to 41 tonnes of methane is being released through the meltwaters every day during the summer months. This is a huge amount of methane lost from the glacial meltwater stream into the atmosphere, says Dr. Peter Wynne, a glacial biochemist at the Lancaster Environment Centre. It rivals some of the world's most methane-producing wetlands and represents more than 20 times the known methane emissions of all Europe's other volcanoes put together. We have a real problem now. What are we going to do? We're going to have to tax countries that have glaciers that release methane. But then what are we going to do about the wetlands that produce methane as well? We can't drain the methane-producing wetlands because they harbour wildlife. Perhaps we need to have a tax on wetlands that produce methane because they are contributing to global warming. Now, there is a whole counter-argument to the global warming theory, and that is that we are heading towards a grand solar minimum. Based on 400 years of sunspot observations, the people that put forward this hypothesis believe that the sun and the amount of sunspots basically influences our climate, not this man-made climate change nonsense. And there is pretty compelling evidence that shows the fact that the cold periods like the Little Ice Age and the medieval warming correspond to the activity on the sun. A good site to look for information on this is called supergsminfo.com, and I thoroughly recommend that people go there. I've also interviewed Scott, who runs that website on the A Minute to Midnight show before as well. According to Scott and the science that he uses to back up his claims, we have now actually begun a descent just in the last couple of years back into another mini ice age. Rather than getting warmer, that we have now turned the corner towards a colder climate. And the signs and symptoms of a grand solar minimum include extreme weather in all categories: record cold, record hot, record droughts, record rain, record hail, extreme cold winters, grow seasons becoming shorter, grow zones shifting, greening of deserts, massive electrical storms, wild weather, early and late frosts. And according to those scientists and so on who believe in this, the fact that we are heading towards a super grand solar minimum are telling you to start watching, because the signs will be beginning now as we make the descent over the next few years down towards a grand solar minimum. Now, no discussion on climate change would be complete without at least mentioning geoengineering and chemtrails and the possibility that they are affecting the weather, at least locally and possibly globally as well. Here is a little section from a video I did with Brooke Ardwin in 2018.
But every morning we find this happening. And many think, of course, this is, all we're wearing tin hats and it's a big conspiracy theory. But I really firmly believe that these people who will just come out and tell us things like this, they have not taken any time to do the proper research, because the information on these chemtrails is absolutely compelling if you take the time to research it. There is, I want to mention a site. It's geoengineeringwatch.org, and it's run by Dane Wigington. He is amazing. He's he's so filled with knowledge when it comes to chemtrails. They interviewed a gentleman called A.G. Griffith. Now, he is supposedly an insider to all these chemtrails, and that's on Dane's site. Even if you just go in his search and put in a purpose of chemtrails, his video will come up. There's some great information on that. So you may want to listen to that. But one of the main purposes, a primary stated goal of these geoengineering programs is to provide a solar shield to slow runaway climate change, per se, as they call it, by spraying tens of millions of highly toxic metal nanoparticles or particulates into the atmosphere from jet aircraft. And of course, there may be many more other objectives behind doing this other than climate change, which I'm sure there are.
There is also the very distinct possibility that geoengineering and using things like HAARP can be used for weather warfare and even for the directing of the paths of storms and so on. But it's beyond the scope of this video to deal with those topics. They're a whole other subject in themselves. If you found this video helpful, please go to our website, aminutemidnight.com, hit the like button on the video on YouTube for us, that would be appreciated, and share this with as many people as you can. Also, A Minute to Midnight is run 100% by donations, and if you want to help, obviously videos like this take a lot of time and work, you can donate at aminutemidnight.com. Thank you for watching, and I hope you found it helpful.